Hey everyone, this was a keynote talk that I gave at the Malta Global Game Jam site in January 2018. I wanted to record it to put online, so I'm afraid this recording is a hotel room in Malta, so the acoustics probably aren't great, but I wanted to get it up shortly after I gave it, so in case people wanted to watch it somewhere else in the world before they entered the jam. So hey, I am Mike. I'm an AI researcher and also an indie designer in my spare time. And this is a short talk about procedural generation and game jams and how to mix the two without getting too stressed. I've got a few background slides which I'll breeze through pretty quickly because it's less important for YouTube. But as my day job, I'm an AI researcher. So one of the things I look at is how to build AI that design video games. I'm building a system called Angelina. This is a screenshot of the latest version. And so I do lots of cool stuff about procedural generation of all kinds of game elements. I also organize a game jam. I organize the Procedural Generation Jam, also called Proc Jam. Every year, we've been running for 4 years now, people get together and build amazing procedurally generated stuff. And there's also lots of resources on the website as well. I'll put that at the end of the talk, so don't worry. And I also used to enter game jams a lot myself. These are screenshots from Ludum Dare entries of mine. I entered that a bunch of times, and some jam entries on itch.io as well. I really enjoyed entering game jams, but I haven't entered one for a while, partly because I've been spending my spare time on a game called Rogue Process, which is a cyberpunk action platformer with some hacking elements. And this game actually came out of a game jam. I made a game for the Cyberpunk game jam, and I decided that I wanted to develop it into something bigger. So I've been working on this for too long. But if you want to find out more, you can go to rogueprocess.run. So this talk is kind of aimed not at people who are already experts at procedural generation, but maybe people who want to try it out for the first time. And so I thought I would start just by telling you what a procedural generator is, because it's a term that we throw around a lot, and it has links to other kinds of generative work, but it's a term that's very game specific. So a procedural generator usually means a bit of code that makes something in a game. It could be a level, or a piece of music, or a piece of art, but some part of your game will be made by this bit of code. And procedural generation is a term that we generally only use when we talk about games, but generating things is actually much bigger than games. It's something that artists do. It's something that people do without code. They do it in craft. They do it with pen and paper when they play games together as kids. And generating stuff, it's not really something that one particular kind of medium owns or is a specialist in. So if you're entering a game jam and you're the coder or you're the artist, generating stuff isn't like your domain. It's its own creative skill. It has its own philosophies and theories and techniques. And so anyone can get involved in generativity. Anyone can build a procedural generator. And if you're using it for your game jam, then I recommend that you get everyone on the team involved, because it's something that everyone can contribute to. Now, there are lots of different ways of using procedural generation. So some generators don't do very much. They basically just sort of perform finishing touches, kind of like a cherry on top of the cake that you've already made. They just randomize a few things here or there, or subtly change some stuff. Other procedural generators make huge decisions. So No Man's Sky, for instance, is responsible for generating every single planet that you land on, what it looks like, what resources are there, what plants grow there, what animals live there. So it has a huge amount of responsibility in terms of the things that you will encounter playing the game. The procedural generator makes most of it. And because of the way humans work, we tend to get most excited about the big and complex procedural generators. So when we write articles about it or talk about things on Twitter or share stuff, we generally look for the cool, exciting, complicated stuff, like Dwarf Fortress's big generator of huge worlds with histories and mythologies and stuff. And I'm the same. I love that stuff. It's super exciting. But if you're someone just getting started, it's important to know that procedural generation or generating stuff, it doesn't have to be complicated and scary. It can be simple and elegant, and basic and straightforward. And actually, those kinds of simple approaches are exactly what you need for a game jam. You need something that you can get going quickly. So to give you some ideas very quickly of things that people have made during a game jam. Here are some couple of quick examples from Prop Jam. So Kid Cosmic was a puzzle game which procedurally generated color schemes, which were used in the puzzles but also just looked nice. So they used some color theory to procedurally generate consistent schemes. One of my favorite entries to the jam, Random Access Character, procedurally generated walking animations and then took a bunch of random 3D models and slapped them onto the skeleton of the animation. And so you end up with like this creature that has a feather for a head and boxes for arms walking around. It's incredibly cool piece of tech. Or how about Chaos Switch? Chaos Switch generated cards that modified the rules of the game so that you could try and swing a battle in favor of one army or the other based on what was going on screen. So you can generate kind of anything. I made an entry once with Marsh Davies. He wanted to build a strategy game with procedurally generated dialogue. So we wrote a system that generated dialogue dynamically based on what happened in the game. It was great fun. The thing to bear in mind when making stuff for game jams, not just a procedural generator, but really anything for a game jam, is that they're basically about moving forwards. Whenever I entered a game jam, every time I wrote a line of code, in my mind I had this knowledge that I probably was never going to come back to this line of code. And so it's true for artwork, it's true for music, you kind of just have to keep going forwards. And so the best advice I can give you is that whatever you do, you should try and make sure that it is additive. And what I mean by that is when you create the basic version of it, it takes like half an hour or an hour. Anything you add onto it afterwards only makes it better. And that's true whether it's game mechanics or a procedural generator or anything. So this is a reason I think why you often see platformers in game jams, because the basic platformer, running and jumping, is good. And anything you add on to that, any extra rules or systems, they only add to the rule set, they only extend it. There's no way to break your game. And it's the same with a procedural generator. You want to try and find a way of generating stuff where adding stuff to the generator can't temporarily break it. And that means that your game is always in a playable state, which is really important for a jam. So today I want to introduce you to this thing called replacement grammars. And I'm only going to go through it very quickly, and it's not super technical or anything, but it's a really useful technique. And basically, replacement grammars are templates. That's all they are. You may have even seen them before, you may have come across them. I'm going to try and give you a couple of angles on them that you might not have seen before, hopefully. So basically, you want to generate something. So maybe it's a line from, like an opening line from a story that you want to write, for instance. So you find some examples of stuff that you already like. So it was a dark and stormy night, maybe. Or if you're generating characters, you might find some examples of, or you might even create them yourself, like concept art of something that you like, or a sketch of a piece of music. And then you think about what in this structure could I vary. So we're going to take the sentence example, so we're going to choose a couple of words that we think we could replace with other words. But for instance, in our characters, we might think, well, I could change the sword on their back to a different weapon, or I could change their hat into a sombrero or something. So what you do is you identify the things that you could vary and change, and then you replace them with what we call a symbol. And a symbol is a way of telling the computer, this thing needs to be decided when the game is being run. So it was a dark and stormy night. We could replace the words dark and stormy with different adjectives. And so we can put a symbol in place of those words. And then we write a list of adjectives that we want to put in its place. And we include that list with our grammar. And so when the computer goes through, it will find a symbol, which we've kind of marked with angled brackets here. And then it will replace that symbol with something from the adjective list. So for instance, it might randomly choose the word dark for this adjective, and then for the next one, it might choose the word stormy, and that would reproduce our original phrase of it was a dark and stormy night. But of course, this generator could produce any kind of output from this. It could produce it was a wet and foggy night, or it was a cold and calm night. And maybe we include the word night in our template, so it can choose a different time of day or a different location. And we can basically extend these grammars as much as we want. We can have rules within rules. And even though, if you've seen these grammars before, you probably saw them for text, there's no reason why it has to be text. When the computer reads the grammar, all you need to do is talk to the programmer on your team or discuss with the rest of your team, if you are the programmer, of what exactly the computer should do when it reads this grammar. So If we wanted to produce characters, for instance, we might have a grammar that describes different body parts. And instead of each word in our grammar being a piece of text, it might refer to a file that our artists have drawn. So when our grammar goes through this template for a person, instead of copying the text sun hat, it looks up the image called sun hat and it places it at a particular place in this image where we think the hat should be placed, basically. So you can adjust grammars and write different grammars for all kinds of stuff. If I knew anything about music, I would probably have a really good example for music on this slide, but I don't. But maybe like a song is made up of an introduction and then a verse and then a bridge. And maybe instead of just having lots of verses, you have several different categories. So you have like happy verses or sad verses or fast-paced verses and slow verses. And you can write multiple templates for different kinds of songs or have it based on something that's going on in the game. And we can do the same for levels. So we could have our grammar break down a level based on difficulty. And then instead of having text or having a piece of artwork, we can have the definition of like a chunk of a platformer level. And then our grammar just needs to paste this into our game world when it wants to actually include this in the game. So the reason I like grammars is because they're very easy to extend. As I mentioned before, they're additive. So once you've got your basic grammar working and the game is able to load and understand things, then you can add things to that grammar anytime you want. And all it will do is make your procedural generator bigger. And generally, that means that it just gets better. So in Rogue Process, you encounter lots of corporations. It's kind of a cyberpunk-themed game, so each building that you break into is owned by a different corporation. And we have a big corporation generator in our game. And one of the nice things about using grammars is that I have a Google Doc with the grammar for the corporation generator, and if I'm like on a lunch break or if I'm too tired to work on the game in the evenings, but maybe I've got enough time to just add 5 or 6 words to the grammar somewhere. And over time, this thing just grows and grows. So you can have your grammar set up after the first few hours of the game jam. And then anyone on your team, if they're taking a break, they've got a slice of pizza, or their brain just isn't working right now, so they can't do their normal work, they could just come over to your grammar and add in a few extra words, or add in a little section of a level. And it's really easy to extend them, which is really pleasant. So to give you a quick example of a game that I think, it doesn't quite use a grammar, but it uses some of the similar ideas in a really powerful way, you can actually look at Spelunky, which, if you've not played it before, it's a platformer made by Derek Yu and released on every platform, basically. And I think it's probably one of the best procedural generators that anyone's ever made. It produces these little dungeon-like rooms where you need to get from a door at the top of the level to a door at the bottom of the level, and you don't know the route through because the world is procedurally generated. Now, the way that it's actually put together is through chunks, just like the chunks of level I was talking about earlier for our grammars. So Derek made a bunch of these chunks. They're approximately the size of a screen, and he made loads of them. And instead of teaching his game about level design or the complexities of his enemies and his physics system and stuff, he just tagged each room based on the directions you could enter and exit from. So this room here, you can enter from the left or the right or down. You can't exit up. Now, this is not exactly how the system works. It's not exactly a grammar, but you can kind of think of it in this way. You can think of Derek has condensed his knowledge about how games work into these tiny boxes, and the only thing the generator has to worry about is this tiny bit of information about how they connect to each other. And then what Spelunky's generator does is it builds a little path through the world, and then for each slot in this path, it just looks into the grammar, it looks into this big collection of rooms, and it tries to find one that has exits that match the path that's shown. So for instance, the first room needs to be enterable from the left and also exit below. And the grammar can easily look that up. It doesn't need to know anything about the contents of these rooms or the game itself. It just needs to know the label on the room. And then it fills in the rest of the level with randomness. And basically what comes out is this incredibly flexible generator that's easy to add stuff to. And I think that's really cool. So that's my pitch for using replacement grammars in your game jam. And now I want to talk to you and just give you a few quick tips about using procedural generation in a game jam. And these will apply whether you're using grammars or something else entirely. So the rule number one is always have an escape route. And this applies in particular if you're using procedural generation for game critical information, like the route that the player needs to go to get to the exit, or an enemy that the player has to defeat. So one of the things that can happen in Spelunky is it can generate pits that the player can fall into. This actually isn't a screenshot of one because I couldn't find one, so don't pay too much attention to this, but trust me, it definitely can do this. And Derek Yu didn't want to write the algorithm such that it avoided generating these pits, or it analyzed like where the player could get stuck or anything like that. He didn't want to do that. So he did something very clever. Instead of adjusting his generator, he adjusted his game mechanics, and he gave the player the tools they needed to get around the failures of his generator. And so he gave them bombs that could break through solid objects, and he gave them ropes that would allow them to climb up to where they'd fallen down from. And this was a really smart idea, because instead of removing the failures from his generator, he turned these failures into interesting situations that the player had to spend resources to get out of. And it opened up so many new opportunities for the game design. So don't try and fix your generator always. Think about ways that you can empower the player to get past these problems. Ask yourself, what is the worst possible thing my generator can do to the player? What is the worst situation they could be in? And how could I give them something that will let them get out of that situation? Point number two, and this is something I see almost every single developer who uses procedural generation do. Let people play with your generator. So what I see them do is when they're making a new generator, they will get really excited about it. They'll start tweeting about it, they'll tell people about it, and they'll talk about how they just love generating new stuff with this generator. And this will go on and on and on. And the thing to realize is that if you're having fun tweaking your generator, changing it, seeing new things come out, then probably if someone else was doing that, they would also have fun with it. And so try and think about ways that you can open up your procedural generator to your player. Don't have it something that just drip feeds them content occasionally. Just give them control over it. So you could give them, it could be as simple as just giving them a button that they can use to generate stuff. So for instance, if you're generating music for your player, for the background for the game, maybe just give them a button that allows them to generate a new piece of music. And this solves several problems at once, because if you've got a problem like we were mentioning before where your generator does something wrong sometimes, maybe it produces a piece of music that they hate, they can just press a button and get a new one. And you don't need to worry about them exhausting all the possibilities of your generator, because game jam games are supposed to be short and sweet, and it's more important that they have fun and explore what you've made. So definitely do this kind of thing. Another alternative is to allow them to exchange certain parts of the generated content for other parts, kind of like a fruit machine. So if you've generated an outfit for them, maybe they don't like one piece of clothing, but they like the rest. So give them a shop in town where they can recycle their clothes and get a new piece of outfit. And then they can mix and match stuff until they find something they like. Or if you're feeling particularly bold, just give them control of the whole generator. In 2015, I made a game called Clay for the AI Jam. And this game used something called cellular automata to generate its levels. And I actually made the core mechanic of the game controlling the variables for the generator and rerunning it. And I dressed it up as like terraforming this planet that you were on. But basically, your astronaut could create new paths through the level by just changing the parameters of the code and then rerunning the code. And it wasn't very complicated to build, and players found it really interesting and unusual, and it allowed them to interact with the algorithm in a way that they haven't done it before. So think about making procedural generation the core of your game, maybe, if you want to be really adventurous. The third piece of advice I have is let it get weird, particularly if your generator produces something that isn't critical to completing the game. So when you're sitting down to generate something or design your generator, and you're thinking about rules or limits, if you have numerical parameters in there and you're saying it should never be more than like 4 or 5, ask yourself, why are you choosing this particular limit? And for a couple of hours, turn off 1 or 2 of these limits and see what happens. Because what you might find is that outside of your assumptions, outside of the range of these limits that you think this needs, you find something amazing. So just try switching off your limits, try doubling all the parameters and see what happens. It's worth doing. And players like it, I think, a lot of the time, unless it produces something which is sort of aesthetically horrible. Sometimes procedural generators break, no matter how simple you try and make them. And in a game jam, that can be very stressful because you need stuff to work. So the first piece of advice I have for this is to write tests. This is actually something that not many procedural generation developers do, I think. But if you need to test why something is happening, don't sit there generating things one by one and looking at them by eye. Write some code that looks for this thing that you want and then generate 1,000 of them. And see like what percentage of things do I expect will have this property and what percentage of things actually have this property. So write little simple tests that say like how often does the word dark appear in the generated text that we use, and is dark appearing too much? Like maybe I should reduce the likelihood or add new words to my dictionary so it appears less often. Just write just a couple of lines of code and it will easily test your theories out. But what if you write tests and it's still broken? Like what if your generator is really, really broken and you only have a few hours left and you're panicking? Well, don't panic, because I'm going to teach you this horrible, dirty, dark secret about procedural generation. I want to say one word to you, just one word, and it's filters. And this is something that people don't think about when they build procedural generators, I think. But we have in our mind this idea that a procedural generator should always produce the thing that we want every time we press go. But actually, that doesn't need to be the case at all, particularly if your generator is very efficient and doesn't take very long to run. If you know what you want, you can just keep trying until you get it out of your procedural generator. So you generate something, maybe a level or a piece of music or an outfit, and then if you know what you're looking for or you know what you want to avoid, you can write a test and say, does this level have this problem? Or is there something bad in this level? And if the bad thing is in this level, just generate another one. And you can probably do it 100 times before the player even notices that it was waiting for something. And so it's okay to do this. It feels counterintuitive, it feels really inefficient, but if you need to fix your generator right now, just filter the bad stuff out. Generate things 1,000 times before the level even loads, and I promise you no one will notice, and you will finish your game and you'll be less stressed as a result. All right, that's enough from me. I really love procedural generation. I think it is incredibly fun, and I think anyone can get involved with it. And I hope that this introduction wasn't too boring or too dry. I hope you feel like, yeah, I could go away and do something. And you don't have to generate the classic stuff. You don't have to generate dungeons. You can generate anything you want. Just think about how to break it up into templates, how to vary stuff around, and try stuff out. It might be bad. It might be weird, it might not work, but that's okay. That's part of what building a procedural generator is. It is experimentation, it is doing weird stuff. So don't be afraid to make stuff that's broken and horrible. And if you do make anything, let me know. I'm on Twitter, not just during the Global Game Jam, but for the duration. If you make something cool, tell me about it. And if you want to find out more about stuff that I do, you can visit some of these websites. Thanks very much for listening, and I will see you some other time.